My husband handed me an envelope at my father's grave. I was 7 months pregnant. They hadn't lowered the casket yet. Divorce papers, dated 3 weeks before the burial. He had them ready before my father was in the ground. He was waiting for my father to die. But that's not the part I can't forgive. My father warned me about him. I stopped speaking to my father for saying it. 3 years of silence. He died in that silence. And the man I chose over him was already filing for whatever my father left behind. Everyone will call him the villain. He is. But I chose him over the only man who saw it coming. The apartment was too clean. That hit me before the grief did. I walked in still wearing my funeral dress, cemetery mud drying on my heels, and everything was spotless. Gage's jacket gone from the hook by the door, his briefcase, his phone charger from the kitchen outlet. Small things, surgical removals. He'd been in this apartment while I was at the burial, or before it. Either way, the math was the same. He served me divorce papers over my father's open grave, and at some point that same day, he came home and unplugged his phone charger. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter. Calicut marble. Gage chose it during the renovation, said the name like it proved something about him. I stood there in my funeral dress, 7 months pregnant, cemetery dirt on my shoes, staring at a white envelope on his perfect marble. I'd moved into Gage's life 4 years ago and decorated exactly nothing. Took me 4 years to realize that wasn't generosity, it was territory. I hadn't read the papers properly at the graveside. I'd seen petition for dissolution of marriage, and then the ground shifted under me and I stopped looking. Now I made myself sit down and read every page. Standard language, division of assets, custody provisions for, and I need you to hear how they phrased this, any minor children born during the marriage. My daughter, not yet born, already a clause. But page 4 stopped me. Paragraph 9, equitable distribution of all marital and inherited assets. Inherited? I read it twice, 3 times. My father had been alive when these papers were drawn up. I was estranged from him 3 years, not a single word between us. I hadn't inherited anything. There was nothing to inherit because my father was still breathing when Gage's attorney typed that word. So why was it there? I flipped to the last page, stapled to the back a courier receipt, Gage's law firm, date stamped. 3 weeks before the funeral. 3 weeks before my father was in the ground, the papers were ready, finalized, waiting, sitting in a drawer at a law firm I'd never heard of, stamped and sealed while my father was still alive. I pressed my hand flat on that marble counter, his counter in his apartment, in the life I'd built entirely on his terms, and I didn't cry. I was too confused to cry. Petitioner, Gage Winfield. Respondent, Ottilie Pembrose Winfield. That's my name on someone else's strategy. I didn't understand it yet, but I knew enough to stop calling it bad timing. I barely slept. The baby kicked through the night, restless like she knew. I lay in the dark on Gage's side of the bed because mine had a dip in the mattress and my back couldn't take it anymore. His side smelled like his cologne. 4 years of marriage, and even the pillows belonged to him. The phone rang at 9:14 the next morning. I know the exact time because I was staring at the courier receipt, trying to count backward, 3 weeks before the funeral. That was mid-November. My father was in the hospital by then, but we didn't know it was terminal. So how did Gage... The phone rang. A woman's voice. Measured. Not cold, not warm, precise. The voice of someone who chose every word before speaking it. Miss Pembrose, my name is Thessaly Verne. I'm an estate attorney. I represented your father. I didn't answer right away. My father had an estate attorney. Of course he did. He ran Pembroke's Capital, built it, grew it, turned it into something I never fully understood because I never thought I'd need to. 3 years ago, after that call, I made sure I wouldn't hear much from him again. Thessaly Verne, my father's attorney, told me she'd been instructed to contact me upon his death, that there were documents to review, that she'd like to meet at her office, that it was, in her words, time-sensitive. I almost said no. Not because I didn't want to know, but because saying yes meant admitting my father had planned for this, planned for his death, thought about me, his estranged daughter, the one who hung up the phone and never called back. He was still thinking about me. During 3 years of silence, he was still making plans that included my name. I said yes. And after I hung up, standing at that same counter, the memory broke through. 3 years old and sharp as glass. A Sunday evening, Gage and I were making dinner. My phone rang and I stepped into the hallway. My father's voice. Not cruel, not angry, just clear. The clearest he'd ever been with me. Oddly, I don't believe he married you for you. I hung up before the 8th. I walked back into the kitchen. I told my father had been rude. I told myself I was choosing my husband, standing by my marriage, being loyal. I was 28. I was so sure I was right. I stood at the counter, phone still warm in my hand, one palm on my belly. I never called my father again. He never called back. 3 years of silence. And now a woman named Thessaly was calling on his behalf because he was dead, and he still, even dead, had a plan for me. 2 men had planned around my father's death. My husband with divorce papers, my father with an attorney. I needed to know what the other man's plan was. The next morning, I did something Gage wouldn't have expected. I went looking. Not in his closet, not in his desk, in the credit card records, our shared account. He'd frozen the main banking, but the card statements were archived on my phone. An app he set up 2 years ago so I could track household spending. His words, his system. He never imagined I'd use it to track him. I scrolled backward through weeks of charges. Groceries, gas, prenatal vitamins, the florist for the nursery. And then, 6 weeks back, a law firm, Carver, Holtz & Breen. Consultation fee, $2,400. I didn't recognize the name. I'd never heard Gage mention them, but I recognized the date. 6 weeks ago was my 24-week OB appointment, the one he missed. And now the memory arrived, specific, ordinary, devastating in the way only ordinary things can devastate when you learn what was hiding inside them. I remember the paper gown. I remember the cold gel on my skin. I remember the technician pointing at the screen and saying, "There's her heartbeat." And I remember reaching for Gage's hand and finding the chair beside me empty. He said he couldn't make it, finishing a deal. I drove home that evening with the ultrasound printout on the passenger seat. Annoyed, just annoyed. The low-grade irritation you swallow because you tell yourself he's busy, he's providing, he's building something for the 3 of us. I walked in and he was making dinner. He kissed my forehead and asked how the appointment went. I showed him the ultrasound and he smiled. Same day, same evening. He sat across from an attorney at Carver, Holtz & Breen, planning what he'd do to us, and then came home and kissed my forehead and smiled at our daughter's heartbeat. I looked at the charge on my phone. $2,400. That's what it cost to begin the paperwork for destroying your family. He tipped more than that at the benefit gala last spring. My father's voice came back to me, sharp as the day I hung up on him. Odalie, Don't believe he married you for you. 9 words I punished him for. 3 years of silence because he dared to say them. And now I was sitting at Gage's counter, holding Gage's credit card records, realizing the man I chose over my father had been planning a divorce while I was alone in a paper gown watching our baby's heartbeat on a screen. I folded the statement and slipped it into my bag, next to the courier receipt. 2 documents, 2 lies. Tomorrow I'd sit across from a woman my father trusted more than his own daughter. Tessely Verne's office was on the 32nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows, city skyline, shelves lined with legal volumes that had actually been opened. Not a showroom, a workroom. The kind of office where people's futures get rewritten while the city keeps moving outside. She stood when I walked in, silver hair cut sharp at the jaw, dark eyes that looked at you, not through you, not past you, at you. Charcoal blazer, ivory blouse, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and a single platinum band on her right hand. No earrings, no watch. She shook my hand with the exact right pressure, firm enough to mean something, brief enough not to linger, and gestured to the chair across from her. No condolences, no small talk. She opened a folder on the table between us. Miss Pimbrose, your father retained me 11 years ago. He updated his estate plan several times, most recently approximately 4 years ago. 4 years ago, just after the wedding. I kept my face still and waited. You are the sole beneficiary of his estate. I nodded. I expected, I don't know, some money, a house I'd never visited, maybe shares in Pimbrose Capital, something I could hold in my mind without my hands going numb. Thessaly placed a single sheet in front of me, estate summary, 1 number at the bottom of the page. $800 million. I'd spent that morning checking whether my debit card still worked at the pharmacy. I looked at Thessaly. She looked back, patient. She'd delivered numbers like this before, sat across from someone whose life was reorganizing in real time while they tried to make a figure fit inside their understanding of the world. $800 million. My father, the man I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, the man I buried 6 days ago, the man whose phone calls I stopped returning because my husband told me he was being controlling, built this and left it to me. All of it. Thessaly put on her reading glasses, one smooth motion, right hand, and continued. The assets are held in a spendthrift trust, discretionary distributions managed by an independent trustee. She paused, for precision, not effect. The trust includes provisions that make its assets unreachable by a spouse in divorce proceedings. She let that sentence sit on the table between us. Divorce-proof. My father had built $800 million and made it divorce-proof. Your father added the protective provisions approximately 4 years ago, after meeting your husband. She took off her glasses. Before your estrangement. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. 4 years ago. He met Gage during the engagement. He attended the wedding. He shook Gage's hand and watched his daughter walk down the aisle. And whatever he saw in that handshake, whatever registered in one meeting, one dinner, one conversation, he didn't argue. He didn't try to stop the wedding. He called Thessaly and said, "Protect her." He saw through Gage before I married him. He built the wall before I slammed the door. And then, a year later, when he finally tried to tell me, I hung up. I gave him 3 years of silence for saying out loud what he'd already spent money to act on in private. A sealed envelope sat at the edge of the folder. My name in handwriting I recognized, the same hand that signed my birthday cards, that wrote "Love Dad" at the bottom of notes I still had in a box somewhere. I stared at it. "We'll come to that," Thessaly said. "When you're ready." I wasn't ready, but I nodded anyway. Thessaly slid the envelope across the table with her fingertips. She didn't hand it to me. She set it on the wood and waited for me to reach. Then she took off her reading glasses and looked toward the window, the city, giving me whatever privacy a conference table allows. My father's handwriting, my name, Ottilie. The same hand that signed my birthday cards, cards I still had in a box in the apartment, cards I hadn't opened in 3 years because opening them would mean admitting I missed him, and I wasn't ready to admit that while I was still proving I didn't need him. I opened the envelope. 1 sheet of paper. 3 lines. "I disagreed with your choice of husband. I believed you would one day need protection from a man who valued what you had more than who you were." And beneath that, in the same steady hand, Thessaly holds my instructions. 28 words. I counted them later that night and the next night. 28 words from a man who had 3 years to write a letter and chose to make it short. Not because he had nothing to say, because he'd already said the only thing that mattered when he called me and I'd hung up before the 8th word. He didn't write, "I love you." He didn't write, "I forgive you." He didn't write, "I wish things were different," or "please call," or any of the things I would have written if I'd had 3 years and a piece of paper and a daughter who wouldn't speak to me. He wrote what he believed, what he'd built, and who to call. That was his love. Not the words, the architecture. $800 million shaped into a fortress with my name on it and a letter that said, in 28 words, everything a phone call couldn't. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. Not my bag. The bag had evidence, the courier receipt, the credit card statement, documents that proved what Gage did. This wasn't evidence. This was the last time my father would ever speak to me, and every word was right. Thessaly waited until I looked up. Then she put her glasses back on and continued with the trust provisions. Professional. Precise. But she looked away when I read it. I noticed that. A woman who never breaks eye contact broke it for me. 2 days after the will reading, Thessaly connected me with a divorce attorney, a woman she'd worked with before on contested estates. I didn't ask how many times they'd done this together. I didn't want the answer. The preliminary discovery requests went out fast. Thessaly's name on the estate side gave the whole thing a weight that Gage's attorneys apparently weren't expecting. Documents started arriving at my apartment in batches, emails, scanned filings, billing records. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor with my laptop because chairs didn't accommodate the belly anymore, and opened each file the way you open doors in a house you know is burning, carefully, knowing the heat is coming. The consultation record from Carver, Holtz, and Breen arrived in the 3rd batch, invoice, billing summary, and the intake form, the one Gage filled out when he first walked into that office 6 weeks before the funeral. The same evening I was in a paper gown watching our daughter's heartbeat alone. Subject line of the consultation: inheritance exposure in pending divorce, probate timing strategy. 7 words. I sat with them the way you sit with a verdict. Inheritance. He knew about the money, or suspected. He'd married the daughter of the founder of Pembrose Capital. He wasn't stupid. He knew what might be coming. Exposure. His vulnerability to losing a claim on wealth he hadn't earned. Pending divorce. He was already planning it 6 weeks out, while telling me he loved me, while putting his hand on my stomach and asking if the baby was kicking. Probate timing strategy. He needed to file while he was still my legal spouse, before the estate cleared probate, before the trust could fully activate its protections. The divorce papers weren't punishment. They were a claim, filed inside a window, delivered on a deadline. The funeral, My father's burial, the casket and the mourners and the rain and my black dress and the cemetery mud, all of it, a delivery window. He chose the funeral because it was the first guaranteed public event where I'd be present and couldn't refuse legal service. My father's funeral was a calendar appointment in Gage's legal strategy. I closed the laptop, pressed both hands flat on the hardwood floor, his floors, in his apartment, in the life he'd designed around me, and breathed until my vision stopped narrowing. $800 million in a fortress my father built, and the man I married was treating my father's death like an opening bell. The next batch of discovery documents arrived the following morning. I almost missed it. Buried in the filing metadata, the kind of data Gage's attorney probably forgot existed, the digital fingerprint that tracks every edit, was a timestamp. Last modified date on the divorce filing document. 2 days before my father died. Not 2 days before the funeral, 2 days before the death. My father was in the hospital. His lungs were failing. He was breathing through a machine. And Gage was sitting somewhere, his office, a coffee shop, our apartment, editing the document that would end our marriage and claim the money my father hadn't finished dying yet. I stared at the date. I did the math. I did it again. He wasn't reacting to the death. He was preparing for it. He was sharpening the blade while the man who built my inheritance was still connected to monitors and oxygen and whatever was keeping him alive in a hospital I didn't visit because I was too proud and too pregnant and too loyal to a husband who was editing divorce papers on his laptop 2 floors above where I slept. And there was more. The draft's creation date, first saved, first opened, first keystroke, 5 weeks before the funeral, the same week he walked into Carver, Holtz, and Breen. So the full sequence was clear now. 5 steps. Consultation, 6 weeks out. He sat across from his attorney and said the words inheritance exposure. Draft created, 5 weeks out. The first version of the papers that would be served at my father's grave. Draft edited 2 days before the death, revised, polished, while my father was dying in a hospital I didn't go to. Papers finalized 3 weeks before the funeral, courier receipt stamped, waiting in a drawer. Delivery, the graveside, the envelope in my hand while the casket sat above the earth. 5 steps, 5 lies, each one documented, each one hidden. A campaign, not a decision, not a man who snapped, a man who built a machine and ran it. And every single step proved what my father tried to tell me 3 years ago in 7 words I hung up on. I put the laptop down, placed my hand on my belly. My daughter moved beneath my palm, alive, oblivious, weeks from being born into whatever was left of this family. I had 5 documents in my bag and 1 letter in my pocket. The documents proved what my husband did. The letter proved what my father knew. Together, they were enough. Tomorrow, I'd call Thessaly and tell her I was ready for the conference room. The night before the conference, I couldn't sleep. The baby had dropped lower. 31 weeks now, and my body was rearranging itself around hers. I lay on my left side because the book said to, a pillow wedged under my belly, another between my knees, the apartment dark around me. Gage's cologne had faded from the pillows. That happened sometime in the last week. I'd stopped noticing exactly when. And the funeral came back. The way it had been coming back since the courier receipt, since the credit card, since the consultation subject line, but differently each time. Every piece of evidence rewrote the same scene. This time, I saw his face. Not the version I remembered at the graveside. The cold husband, the cruel timing, the man who chose the worst possible moment because he was angry or punishing me or making a statement. That's what I'd believe standing there in the rain with the envelope in my hand, that it was personal. It wasn't personal. I could see it now, lying in the dark with his pillow under my knees. His face, when he handed me the envelope, it wasn't cold. It was composed. The way he looked before a client meeting, the way he was executing something he'd rehearsed. He wasn't angry. He wasn't guilty. He wasn't even uncomfortable. He was on schedule. And the detail I'd missed, the one I couldn't believe I'd missed, his eyes. When he placed the envelope in my hand at my father's graveside, he didn't look at the casket, not once, didn't glance at the flowers, the grave, the earth, the mourners. He looked at my hands. He watched the envelope land in my fingers the way a process server watches for confirmation of receipt. My father's funeral was a service location. I was the respondent. The mourners were witnesses. The casket was scenery he didn't need to acknowledge because it wasn't part of his filing. The cruelty I'd felt at the graveside, that raw, impossible cruelty of being served divorce papers over my father's body, it wasn't cruelty, it was logistics. He needed to serve papers within the probate window. The funeral was the first guaranteed event where I'd be present and identifiable and unable to refuse. He chose it the way you choose a conference room, availability and efficiency. And that was worse than cruelty, because cruelty means he felt something, rage, contempt, revenge, something. Logistics means I was a line item. My father's death was a trigger event. The funeral was a deadline met. I put my hand on my belly. My daughter shifted beneath my palm. She'd never know any of this. The grave, the envelope, the man who served her mother papers over her grandfather's body. She'd grow up inside the fortress her grandfather built, and she'd never meet him. She'd have $800 million and no memory of the man who saw the threat before anyone else, because he loved his daughter enough to act on what she refused to hear. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I'd walk into a conference room carrying 5 documents and 1 letter. The documents would end the war. The letter was the only thing that mattered. The conference room was neutral territory, a downtown firm neither side had used before. Long, polished table, overhead lighting that flattened everything. No shadows, no warmth, no hiding. Water glasses that nobody touched. Gage sat across from me with his attorney, a man I'd never met. Gray suit, leather folder, the professional calm of someone billing $600 an hour. Gage wore charcoal, same suit color as the funeral. I wondered if he noticed. Probably not. It was just his uniform. He looked at me once when I walked in. His eyes dropped to my belly, 31 weeks now, visible beneath my dark dress, and came back up. No expression I could read. Not guilt, not concern, not hostility. The controlled neutral of a man who'd already decided this was a negotiation, not a reckoning. Thessaly sat beside me, charcoal blazer, ivory blouse, reading glasses on the chain. Her folder was on the table, closed. She hadn't opened it yet. Gage's attorney spoke first. Settlement proposal. He slid a single page across the table. A number. I read it upside down before it reached me. I won't say what it was. I'll say this. It was the number you offer someone you believe has nothing. No assets, no representation, no leverage. A number designed to make a 7 months pregnant woman grateful for whatever she could get. Thessaly didn't touch the page. She didn't argue the number. She didn't counter. She placed her hand flat on her own folder, the way you place your hand on something you've been carrying for a long time, and opened it. Before we respond to your offer, there's something you should be aware of. First document. She slid it across the table the way she always did, fingertips only, letting the recipient pick it up. Miss Pembrose is the sole beneficiary of her father's estate. The approximate value is $800 million. She let the number sit. Gage's attorney reached for the document. Gage didn't move. His jaw shifted, that clench I'd seen 1,000 times, the one I used to think meant he was concentrating. Now I knew it meant he was recalculating. Second document, the trust structure. The assets are held in a spendthrift trust with discretionary distributions managed by an independent trustee. The trust was restructured approximately 4 years ago with provisions specifically designed to exclude marital claims in the event of divorce. Thessaly took off her reading glasses. She looked at Gage, not his attorney, Gage, and waited. She didn't say, "designed to stop you." The architecture said it for her. His nostrils flared, the first involuntary tell. His right hand moved to his left wrist, the watch adjustment, the self-soothing gesture I'd cataloged over 4 years of marriage without understanding what it meant. He was reaching for control and finding less of it than he expected. Third document, the timing evidence. Thessaly laid the pages in chronological order: courier receipt, credit card consultation charge, consultation subject line, draft timestamp, 4 pieces of paper, a timeline of a campaign. We believe this evidence demonstrates that the timing of the divorce filing was designed to coincide with the probate window in order to claim marital interest in the inheritance. Gage's face. I watched it the way I'd watched the funeral memory the night before, forensically, looking for what I'd missed, and what I saw was a man realizing he'd lost to someone who wasn't in the room. The will, his eyebrows lifted, surprise. He hadn't known the number. The trust, his jaw tightened further, disbelief. He hadn't known it was protected. The timing evidence, his eyes moved from the documents to Thessaly, to me, and then, for the first time since I'd known him, to his own hands, flat on the table, still. He had nothing left to adjust. He lost to my father, a man he dismissed, a man he considered irrelevant to his strategy, a man who shook my hand at an engagement dinner and saw through him in the time it took to order wine, and went home and called his attorney and said, "Protect my daughter from the man she's about to marry." 4 years ago, before the estrangement, before the plan, before the papers, before the funeral, before the grave, my father built the wall before Gage picked up the first brick. Gage's attorney cleared his throat. "We'd like to request a brief recess." Gage didn't speak. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the documents and the posture of a man who had run out of moves. The suit was the same. The jaw was the same, but the performance, the 4-year performance of a man who was always 3 steps ahead, that was over. He wasn't ahead. He wasn't even in the game. The game was played 4 years ago by my father and Thessaly Verne, and Gage was only now finding out he'd already lost. Thessaly closed her folder, placed her glasses back on the chain, folded her hands on the table, and waited, the way she always waited, in silence. After impact. I didn't go home right away. There was a bench outside the building, stone, cold even through my dress, tucked beside a strip of ornamental grass and a row of black planters somebody paid too much for. Downtown still moving. Taxis, phone calls, men in suits crossing the plaza like their lives were still made of appointments. Mine wasn't, not exactly. Mine had just been reduced to a folded letter in my pocket and a child turning under my ribs. I sat down and took the letter out again. Not the trust documents, not the will, not the evidence. Those had done their job. The courier receipt, the credit card charge, the consultation intake, the metadata, all the paper that proved what Gage did. That wasn't what I needed now. I needed 27 words from a dead man. The paper was already soft at the creases. I'd opened it in Thessaly's office, read it again that night, read it again in the apartment, and somehow I still had the stupidest thought a person can have with a dead man's letter in her hands. Maybe this time it'll say more. It didn't. Same 3 lines, same steady handwriting, same refusal to comfort me just because comfort would have been easier to write. I disagreed with your choice of husband. I believed you would one day need protection from a man who valued what you had more than who you were. And then, Thessaly holds my instructions. That was it. No apology for being right. No accusation for the 3 years I gave him. No, I love you, though I know now he did. A man doesn't spend 4 years building a wall around $800 million for a daughter who won't answer his calls unless he loves her. He just doesn't. The baby moved. A sharp roll under my hand this time, not a flutter. 31 weeks. Close enough to birth that strangers had started smiling at my stomach in elevators. Close enough that I could picture her now. Not clearly, but enough. A small face. Dark hair, maybe. My father's hands, or mine. And she'd never meet the man who saved her future. She'd inherit the fortress and none of the memory. I looked at the letter again and understood something I should have understood much earlier. The truth doesn't fix anything. I thought it would. I thought if I got enough proof, enough dates, enough documents, enough language precise enough to pin Gage to the table, then something inside me would settle. It didn't settle. It just made the hurt make sense. And that is not the same thing as peace. Peace would have been one more phone call, one answered call, one dinner, one chance to say, you were right, and I'm sorry I made you pay for that. What I had instead was clarity, expensive clarity, legally useful clarity, the kind that protects your child and leaves your chest empty. A man at the end of the bench stood up, buttoned his coat and walked away. I hadn't noticed him sit down. That's grief for you. It makes the whole world background. I folded the letter carefully, once across the center, then again, the same folds every time, not because I was preserving it, because I couldn't make myself create a new crease in his handwriting. The wind moved through the planters. My hand went back to my belly. He protected me in death because I wouldn't let him protect me in life. So tell me, and I mean really tell me, who failed whom? I put the letter back in my pocket. I'd read it again that night, and tomorrow, and probably every year on the day he died. It would never answer back. That was the cost. 3 mornings later, I was back in the kitchen with a different piece of paper in my hands. Funny, the way rooms remember you. Same marble, same windows, same city outside pretending everyone's life still makes sense. But the first time I stood there, I was holding something meant to take from me. This time, I was holding the thing that saved what was left. I used to think protection would feel warm. It doesn't always. Sometimes it feels like paperwork. Sometimes it feels like a trust I didn't ask for and a letter that says exactly what it means and then stops. That's what I understand now. My father didn't know how to reach me anymore. Maybe he never did. Not after that call. Not after the years I gave my pride in the man I chose over him. So he did the only thing left that couldn't be hung up on. He built something stronger than a conversation. And Gage, well, he saw money. My father saw the man looking at it. Those are not the same kind of vision. A few days later, I found the birthday cards he kept sending before he stopped. I didn't open them, not because I was afraid of what they'd say, because the letter had already said the only thing I needed to live with. He was right, and he loved me in the only language I left him. Would he have answered if I'd called? I think so. I do. A man doesn't spend 4 years protecting a daughter who won't speak to him unless part of him is waiting for the phone to ring. But thinking so and knowing so are different countries, and there isn't a bridge between them. The baby moved while I stood at his grave at dusk. That's what stayed with me. Not the money, not even Gage's face in the conference room. Just that small movement under my hand while I held the letter. Past and future in the same body. His words against the child he'll never meet. Maybe that's what inheritance really is. Not money, not even protection. Just the unfinished sentence you spend the rest of your life carrying.
This is American Billionaire Tales, where fortune meets fate. Some protection arrives after the apology becomes impossible. Next time, husband mocked his wife while signing the divorce. She stayed quiet, not because she was beaten, because one file in the judge's hand was about to destroy everything he thought he could take. Subscribe